Thank you for joining us. My name is Jill Pappenheimer, and I am a partner at BPM, and I am happy to have you join us this afternoon along with Sequoia Consulting Group in talking through the considerations around exiting a PEO. And we hope not to overwhelm you with all the information because there's quite a bit of components to a transition, whether you're ready to move now or considering the transition down the road. It's important to know what's ahead with this possible move out of a PEO. And we're going to be looking at this from multiple angles, from moving to an internal HR model and all of the components that go into that, from a benefits, 401k, PNC, and more perspective, and from timing to what a project may look like. So we're glad to have you with us. Again, I'm Jill Pappenheimer from BPM, and I lead our HR consulting practice. And we support organizations from small to large on the HR function, and that may be complete outsource of the HR function or consulting in certain areas from tactical to strategic. We do a lot of work around culture and supporting organizations that may just be challenged in various HR ways. People ways, I should say, people-related ways. We've done many, many PEO transitions, probably over 50 in our history. And so I look forward to guiding those of you present with thinking through what this might look like.
Great, thanks, Jill. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us here today. My name is Jose Gonzalez. I lead our mid-market team at Sequoia Consulting Group. And just like Jill mentioned, we have had a lot of experience helping organizations decide when is the right time to maybe transition off of the PEO model. And I'm looking forward to covering some considerations around the benefits here today. So thank you.
Hi, and good afternoon. I'm Suzette Germano, and I lead the property and casualty brokerage practice at Sequoia Consulting Group. I've been in the insurance industry for over 30 years, 6 of those as a property and casualty broker and risk management advisor, and for 24 years as the in-house risk manager, leading global risk management functions for Sun Microsystems and Autodesk. And my team at Sequoia, we work closely with dozens and dozens of clients that are in the midst of transitioning from a PEO into a standalone program and help them replace the property and casualty policies that they may have otherwise had when they were in service with a PEO.
And my name's Molly Knapp. I'm a senior 401k consultant with Sequoia. I've been in the 401k industry for over 20 years. And our role with our clients is to provide fiduciary governance. We are fiduciaries on the investments, vendor management, compliance, really all aspects of the 401ks. We're there to make sure that you're covered from a fiduciary liability standpoint, and we're also engaging employees.
So some of the considerations to take into account when considering moving from a PEO. And you may be at various stages of this process. You may have decided to leave a PEO. You may be still considering. Some of the components that are going to affect that decision is where you are in your growth from an organizational standpoint. We'll start just on that bottom left bullet around culture. So you may be in a growth stage where you really need to focus on your culture and look to move away from a co-employer relationship to one where you can evolve your culture and align people to what really is driving you as an organization from your mission, vision, and evolving around core values. You may be looking at wanting to develop your own customized policies and practices that are unique. So in a PEO, you are limited to the policies and practices that may be created as part of that PEO and delivered and distributed to the client base. So this would be an opportunity to really look at customizing those practices unique to your organization. And then from a cost perspective, when you're within a PEO, depending on which PEO you're in, there's going to be different ways of being billed for the services. It could be tied to payroll. And if you're a highly compensated, weighted organization, the cost may be, might be high, maybe a little bit prohibitive. If you're, there's different models with different PEOs, but another challenge around the PEO is being able to identify the GL line items and really being able to look at all your costs and how they are associated with the PEO billing process. So that can be a challenge for you. So getting that clarity around the costs and how they're associated within your organization with the HR function is a benefit of getting out of a PEO. But like I said, a PEO may work for you depending on where you are in your life cycle of your organization. So internal HR model considerations. When you think about leaving a PEO such as TriNet or Insperity or others, you need to think about what your HR function is going to look like internally. So you have payroll and HR. You might want to have dedicated resources to that. You might want to hire an entity such as ours to do outsourcing or consulting around that. We may be interim to you as you make the transition, and then you might want to hire internally. So all kinds of different ways you can look at supporting the HR function. You'll want to look at defining those policies and practices. You'll want to make sure you're being compliant with the state and federal regulations. You're going to need to register in each state you're in from a ID number. You'll need to create an employee handbook. The onboarding of employees, you'll have an opportunity to create a unique onboarding process for each employee. You might want to take that to another level as you're elevating your HR function internally. Then developing programs and initiatives that are unique. And I would argue that during this time of COVID and the pandemic, if you're, for example, looking at moving out of a PEO because of pricing, maybe that's the main component for you. This could be an opportunity to really see the benefit of creating a culture where people are really aligned to your organization, both with each other and to initiatives, to what's driving the organization forward. So I would argue that retention could be an issue as we progress throughout this pandemic and beyond, and that really developing a unique way to keep people aligned is key. And this last sentence there around the human resources system, ideally, we would, whether you're doing this with or without us, evolve the compliance pieces that are necessary. And I can't go through all of them in this because it's just too many. But the system that you choose should support as many policies and practices to address those compliance issues as possible. So it'll be important to select partners, whether, again, you're hiring internally to support your HR function or using an outsourced entity. You could also want to involve an outsourced entity to project manage this transition, because it is a meaty one. And then you'll want to select a system that meets your needs, a payroll company, a benefit, property and casualty insurance broker, 401k provider, COBRA administrator, and there's more. So there's opportunities to get the support and also select those vendors that are going to meet your needs. When you're looking to, this is a big part of a transition project, is selecting the system that's going to support your HR function. So when you're in a PEO, you're using their system. And the system that supports payroll, that supports compliance, leave management, compensation. You may have various components that are supported through the PEO. And it'll be an opportunity to select a system that's going to meet your needs once you leave. And that system might integrate with learning and development system or recruiting system. So there's a lot to think about in terms of picking a system that's going to support the organization, and again, all of these pieces that are included. Another piece of a system implementation is determining workflows and approval levels. So building out that system so that it's fully functional and supportive of policies and practices that you've chosen for your organization are key. And so making sure that that implementation and that configuration, both with moving data and building out the system, is really important that that's done well. Culture is key. Culture is key. Aligning people to your mission, vision, and core values are key. Who are you as an organization? It's a little bit challenging to really identify those key pieces when you're part of a PEO and you have a co-employer relationship. It can be done, but it's harder. So defining who you are, and then policies and practices, as I mentioned, that are unique, hiring people that are the right fit for your organization, and ensuring you've got that engagement, collaboration, and retention. And then aligning people around performance and holding people accountable to what the work is that they need to get done while they're working remotely is a challenge. And there are ways to have systems that help support that. There are ways to develop processes that help support that. And so really this is an opportunity to evaluate your HR function and how you can take it to the next level to make it a really powerful entity within your organization.
Thank you, Jill. And again, thanks everybody for having us here today. I have, as I mentioned, I lead our mid-market team at Sequoia. We generally are working with organizations that are somewhere between 100 and 500 employees, and generally we see PEO transitions start, at least the conversations start in that time frame. I've also had the pleasure of working with Jill and her team on a number of successful transitions as well. And what I hope what we can take away from this section on the benefits piece is just there's some nuances really to really think about and kind of get started early on. So we'll hopefully with this section we'll be able to point out some things that are key in kind of planning for the transition, because benefits, especially in this environment that we are in with COVID, is a really important piece to make sure it goes smoothly. There's nothing more that can create anxiety than having any issues with access to care these days. So as was discussed by Jill, there's a number of components. We are not going to cover all these in this section, but what I'm going to try to focus on is how do we think about duplicating coverage for our employees and their families and make that a positive experience. Secondly, there's quite a bit of a financial analysis to be done. There's some, depending on the PEO that you're on, it can sometimes be difficult to really compare benefits costs from your PEO to what is open or available to you in the open market. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then most importantly, you could have a great offering, but if you don't have a solid communication strategy, you do not get the value to your employees of what you're rolling out and what you're investing in. So communication is very, very important in any rollout of not only a PEO conversion, but also any rollout of new programs. So there's kind of four main areas that we try to make sure that we are really focused on. One is just the program design and the negotiation. So you are going from a PEO relationship, and PEOs can be great for you depending on the stage that you're at as an organization. Sequoia actually operates a PEO within our organization for some of our smaller companies. So we truly understand a lot of the components that go into this. But from a program design and negotiation, you definitely want to make sure that you are creating plans that are meaningful for your population. And when you're exiting a PEO, you have more control in what you're going to offer. So that's something that we definitely want to make sure we're delivering options that provide value. Then I already touched on communications, but it's really important to be clear around what are the wins for your employees and their families in this transition, because they need to understand there is potentially some work involved. They may be receiving a new W-2, and there's things that they have to sort of manage a little bit differently. And so we definitely want to highlight the wins and find some wins for them. And it's not always just cost. So I'll talk about some examples a little bit later. The third piece is administration. Now, you're going from an all-in-one solution where a lot of the things that maybe are being done behind the scenes in a PEO relationship maybe get taken for granted. And you want to have a good action plan on what things you're comfortable taking on in-house and what things you still want to leverage maybe a third party for. So we'll talk through that. And then finally, compliance. When exiting the co-employment relationship, there are going to be things that now are going to be on your plate. Nothing that's impossible to do, but it's just good to have a good visibility and program and plan of attack to make sure you're getting to compliance pieces on a timely manner. So a couple of considerations, just starting with the planning and analysis. Right now, we are having discussions with many organizations that are starting to think about a transition for January. We generally say that it takes a good 4 to 6 months to plan this type of project from beginning to end, meaning we're interested in exploring what does life look like outside of the PEO model, from pricing to analysis to making decisions on your plans, implementation of systems, communication, all the way until where the rubber meets the road. And we like to say when that employee can actually use their benefit program on January 1st. We like to have a good extended timeline to hit all these pieces. But it starts with your strategy. A lot of the things that we like to do, especially when you're coming off a PEO, it's not uncommon to be in a PEO relationship. And when you look at the plans that your employees are selecting, it may be anywhere from 10 to 15 different plans, where generally you would see organizations offer maybe 4 to 5 at most medical plans. So part of the process is how do we funnel those options into a more manageable, scalable array of plans? And how do we make sure that what we're putting in place is competitive in the market? So we do a lot of work around benchmarking of the plans that are being selected so that we make sure that the offering is competitive and providing adequate care. The second piece is the cost analysis. We work with organizations to not only look at the benefits cost component, and this is where it can get tricky sometimes, depending on the PEO that you're on. It may not be the easiest to really truly understand what premiums are for your existing benefits to make a true comparison once the market quotes come back. And so we help with that piece, but it's also understanding what are you paying in an administrative fee and what would it cost to replace the systems that today you're leveraging under the PEO package, and what would it cost to replace those systems? And Jill and team can really help on that piece as well. Finally, on the planning piece, really understanding how are we going to process enrollments. And we 100% want to make sure that things are automated as much as possible. So it's selecting your benefits admin, Ben admin system. And sometimes you'll purchase an all-in-one solution. Sometimes you may just decide on having a best of breed benefits admin system. And the work becomes how do we integrate that with our HRIS and with our payroll system. A couple of timing considerations is, most groups do like to choose a transition date of January 1st because that is when taxes reset the tax year. But there are some cases you may be on a PEO that their open enrollment is within the calendar year, and it's possible to transition, but there's some things to sort of think about. You want to make sure you understand, if we move to a new plan, are we going to be subject to new deductibles? And if so, many times the carriers that we go out and solicit quotes from can give you a credit on any deductibles that have been met already by your employees. Because if we didn't do that, they would potentially have to meet 2 deductibles in 1 calendar year. Generally, plans have deductibles resetting on a calendar year. The last piece on timing is payroll considerations. When you transition mid-year, many times you can carry over your taxes that are wage-based limits on. So you just want to make sure you check with your tax consultant on that piece, but it is possible. Whereas when you transition on a calendar year, it automatically is a reset date anyways. And a couple of other pieces as well. Just don't be surprised if you like to replace your current existing carriers under the PEO. Sometimes it's not as easy to quote those same carriers. They're not looking to compete against themselves. So just understand that. Non-PEO carriers many times will be the most aggressive when it comes to putting options on the table to win your business. And on the administrative side, I've covered some of these, but really thinking about how are we going to do COBRA administration? How can we leverage a third-party vendor that integrates into our benefits administration system so that things are as automated as possible? And then billing is another key component. We are now going to have bills from separate insurance carriers. How can we reconcile all of that? And many groups do decide to reconcile their billing when they come out of the PEO model, as they're used to having a consolidated bill. And finally, compliance, which depending on your partner, you want to have a good calendar view of what's due when, and have good reminders of when to take action on those things. So some of this we've kind of touched on already, but just from 4 main pillars that we really want to keep in mind as you're considering your options from a plan design perspective, really exploring the major carrier offerings and making sure that they're nationwide. What you don't want to have is just regional coverage, and if you hire an employee in another state, then you have trouble extending coverage to them. So we want to make sure that this is a scalable plan array, that you're not looking to have to make changes a year from now, because that's a lot of change. You want to evaluate your current enrollments. And like I said, if you have an array of 15 different plans that employees are enrolling on, it's not uncommon in the PEO model. How do we distill that down to 3 to 4 that makes it more manageable and easier to explain to employees, and they have an easier choice to make when they're going through the onboarding process? The other piece is contribution strategy, which is essentially the share of premium that you are paying on behalf of employees. And that's another decision point that you'll be making. And many PEOs might have, for example, a fixed dollar allocation, meaning you'll pay X amount of dollars per employee per month. And if there's 30 plans and 20 of them are more expensive, the employees can just go shopping and purchase whichever coverage is best for them. And generally, we see different setups where it's just a percentage based of employee or dependents. So we can help you set that strategy and also touch on what's market practice. And then finally, the employee programs. It's not just about the insurance options. It's also what else can we provide to our employees in this transition to help them feel well supported, whether it's discount programs or making sure they have access to telemedicine, which is a very big topic these days with the situation that we're in. And then it's a good opportunity to really look at, do we want to explore different point solutions for maybe mental health or family programs? It's just a good time to take a step back. On the data and analytics side, there's not a whole lot that PEOs will provide in terms of utilization patterns of your plan. So you're really going to rely on, how are employees making choices today? What are the demographics that we have? And how do we create meaningful choice or a meaningful array of plans that hit hopefully the different needs of our employees? And some organizations will actually do a benefit survey before the transition just to gain a little bit more knowledge on how employees are using and valuing the programs. There is also an opportunity to look at a different funding strategy. Most groups we see go into a fully insured arrangement. Some of them will look at a partially self-insured plan, which many of you might know is called level funding, where if you perform better than what the insurance company projected in claims, you could receive a refund. So essentially a reward for having a healthy population. And then eventually looking at a self-insured arrangement. But most groups coming off PEO will go directly into fully insured or level funding. And then lastly, you want to make sure that you create leverage in the market. So making sure you go out to all the major carriers and really just explore a full market analysis of all the carriers to create competition and essentially try to get the best value for the plans and premiums that come back from the market. But lastly, in many cases, when there is quite a bit of competition, you can sometimes negotiate carrier budgets for well-being programs, which you could tie into some of these other point solutions that I mentioned earlier. So with that said, I'm actually going to turn it over to Suzette for risk management.
Great, thanks, Jose. And we can just jump right into the content and head into this slide. Today, I thought it might be helpful if we discuss the property and casualty or business insurance policies that'll need to be considered when exiting a PEO. There are several benefits to your organization when placing coverage outside of a PEO. Generally, your cost for the same limits of insurance will be less. You may be able to increase the amount and type of insurance or reduce deductibles and retentions. Additionally, because you'll have access to the entire insurance market, competition among carriers will help you derive the most competitive and most comprehensive programs to ensure really robust balance sheet protection. The coverage that is most often inclusive in PEO offerings is workers' compensation and employers' liability, which are actually a bundled policy. And because these are required by statute, you'll be required to replace those coverages directly with insurers as you come off of a PEO. And you'll want to make sure that you're choosing an effective date that matches the date that you leave the PEO so you have no gap in coverage. Additionally, for involuntary workers' compensation insurance will need to be purchased if you have domestic employees who travel abroad for business. Your domestic workers' compensation policy will not cover claims that occur outside of U.S. borders. So if you intend to have U.S. staff traveling abroad, the coverage can be added to your commercial insurance package pretty easily, and it's an inexpensive add-on. Employment practices liability protects employers from claims like wrongful termination, discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. And it is generally also included as a coverage within PEOs. Over the last 3 years, we've seen EEOC complaints increase by over 300%, with a huge uptick in claims related to gender, harassment, racial bias, discrimination. This is a really important policy to pay attention to as you're transitioning. It's also important to note that your new policy should include a prior impending claim date that's equal to the first date of cover where you had employment practice liability through a PEO, or if you had that policy standalone even prior to joining a PEO. What that does is it gives you kind of an extension of coverage back in time for claims that have occurred but have not yet been reported to you. And that's a really important component as you come out onto your own policy to make sure that you have no gaps in coverage, because the day that you exit the PEO's policy, any claims that have occurred but have not yet been reported would no longer be covered under the PEO's policy. Fiduciary liability will also be needed in the event that you're forming a 401k plan. And while this coverage protects decision makers and employers from claims related to any ERISA-based plan, most claims that we see come through are related to 401k administration, decision-making, mismanagement of plans. So also another policy that you'll want to consider if you aren't already purchasing it. And then crime insurance or a fidelity bond, which can actually take the place of an ERISA bond, which you'll need in the event that you don't have either crime and fidelity. But a crime policy actually offers both first-party coverage against theft claims and also covers claims made by third parties against your company, where maybe either the organization or someone on your staff is accused of theft. And then, as you're starting to evaluate your needs for a provider, before you even begin this transition off, you just want to make sure that you're selecting a broker that can not only help with coverage placement, but that they're already familiar with your industry, clients in your industry, and any of the operational risks that you're facing. While business insurance is very broad and there's a lot of different coverage available out there, policies are actually written very specifically to address the needs and exposures of an organization. And working with a broker that is familiar with your industry really helps you shortcut to make sure you're getting the right policy with the right coverage in place. Additionally, those providers should make sure that they have resources that are supporting you around loss control services, claims management, in the event that you're global or have plans to go global, that they have global breadth, and that they're providing you with technology tools to help you manage your policies, keeps your program efficient. It makes sure that any handoff or transition of responsibility with regard to business insurance is done smoothly, and you're able to provide documentation if necessary at the time of a claim or at the time of an audit. Next slide, please. To obtain quotes for these types of coverage, you're going to want to make sure that you're providing your broker the underwriting information necessary so they can market your program. And as Jose mentioned, you're really going to want to do a full marketing of the program. This is the first time that you'll have been out in the market outside of a PEO, and really testing the market for coverage is what's going to suit you in terms of getting both the most comprehensive coverage as well as the most competitive pricing. For workers' compensation, you'll need to provide a report that includes both current payroll by class code and state, head count at each location, and physical addresses for those locations, and then 3 years of loss runs. These are reports that generally the PEO is able to provide you as long as you know what you're asking for. And the next slide that we'll get to in a minute, we've included a sample report of what the workers' compensation data points would look like that you'd want to request. And one of the other things to keep in mind is that with workers' compensation insurance, while you'll be looking at policies that are using your current payroll as a rating mechanism, you're also going to want to give them projected headcount and payroll growth over the 12 months of that policy. Workers' compensation is an auditable policy, and oftentimes in a PEO, you're paying as you go. So as you onboard staff or as you reduce staff, you're paying the premium ratably. With an insurance policy that is standalone, there will be a true-up at the end of that policy. Either you'll get money back if your payroll is actually under what was estimated, or you will have to pay additional premium. So really being mindful of that when you're setting the expectation of payroll for that 12-month cycle. It's looking at where your payroll will be at the end of the policy when it terminates versus where it begins. And then to obtain quotes for employment practices liability, fiduciary, and crime, you'll need to complete a management liability application. And the initial application is fairly lengthy, and it may take some time to complete because it isn't something that you've had to do in the past. You may need to go to other parties within your organization to obtain the answers to the questions. So just make sure you leave yourself enough time to thoroughly complete the underwriting applications and get those back in the hands of your broker so they're able to get those to market for you. And then as previously noted, the for involuntary workers' compensation can just be added to your commercial package that exists for pretty much every business already today. And then next page. And here, this will be in the documents that will be available to you after the webinar. This is the sample report that you'd want. You could provide just even this page if you needed to the PEO who's administering your program today to make sure they could give you a workers' compensation payroll report that is inclusive of the information needed for underwriting. And then the next page, please. And just a couple of notes on timing for property and casualty quotes. Because this is new insurance, you're going to want to make sure that you give your broker ample time to really market that program and present you options. It's best to begin this process on property and casualty about 90 days prior to your anticipated PEO extraction. On the benefits side, I know that there's a preference and a need to actually begin about 6 months in advance, preferably. With property and casualty, because those quotes that are provided actually will expire no later than 45 days from when the insurance company issues them, they'll actually want a slightly tighter window. And as clients start to evaluate the pros and cons of leaving a PEO, oftentimes we're asked if we can provide quotes for the replacement property and casualty policies. But oftentimes they're doing that evaluation at the start of the process where they would with benefits. And one of those challenges is that as we provide you pricing, insurers are expecting then a quote to come from that. And so my recommendation would be, instead of asking for a firm quote, you ask your broker to provide you either a soft quote or an indication that gives you both an idea of what the pricing parameters would be for each of these types of policies for budget purposes, understanding that the actual underwriting will be done much closer to the policy actually being incepted. And then you're going to want to make sure that you bind the policies at least a week prior to leaving the PEO. Oftentimes, organizations will have a number of certificates of insurance that are meeting different contracts, whether it's your leases or partner vendor agreements, maybe things that you'd be using for an offsite. And your workers' compensation insurance is generally one of the things that's requested on those certificates. Providing your broker a bind order gives them time to reissue those certificates to make sure you're in compliance with all of your contractual obligations. And then the last piece would be to make sure you're working with your broker to strategically align the new policy renewal dates, so all of those new replacement policies that you're going to put in place, with your existing business insurance policies. This will help leverage your carrier relationships, and oftentimes when you're bundling some of those policies together, maybe your business insurance policy with your workers' compensation, it really drives a better pricing outcome for you. But it'll also help you manage your program as efficiently as possible, eliminating multiple renewal dates throughout the year and multiple times that you'll have to touch or manage the business insurance program. And with that, I'll hand it off to Molly to discuss the 401k transitions.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Suzette. So I'll jump right in the interest of time. So we're going to spend the next 10 minutes going through the multiple employer transition considerations as well as fiduciary considerations. So for those of you that are in a PEO, oftentimes accompanying a PEO is what's called a multiple employer plan. You'll hear it called a MEP or an MEP, and it is essentially a pooled 401k plan that multiple adopting employers go into, and they qualify because they're in the PEO. So as you go into the PEO and you're in the PEO, you have the choice to go into the multiple employer plan. But when you exit the PEO, you also have to exit the multiple employer plan. So as you're moving out of a PEO plan, the one thing that you need to also make sure you have bandwidth is the move out of the multiple employer plan into a single 401k plan. And that transition period, I would say for most record keepers is 90 days, meaning they need notification 90 days prior to the new effective date of the new single employer plan. And then you want to cushion that with time to do your vendor search and pick your final vendor that you're going to move forward with. Another consideration is the assets. So the assets that are in your plan under the PEO, or excuse me, under the MEP will move over into the single employer plan, and there's considerations of how those assets will come over. They will come over trustee to trustee, so you don't have to worry about participants moving money out as the transfer happens, but there's different ways to move those assets over. Compliance considerations, just to note that employees that have their time of service will always carry over from their original hire date, but things that are new from a compliance standpoint is at a macro level with the MEP files the Form 5500 each year, and I don't know why I keep dropping out, but I've got the slide here if I do. The MEP files the 5500, and if you are audit eligible, which an MEP would be, there is an independent auditor and audit that needs to be done each year. Generally, it's about 120 employees. So when you move out of the MEP, you will have to file your own 5500. It's typically prepared by the record keeper. And then just make sure you account for potential audit costs as you're looking at your costs moving forward. From a discrimination testing, if you have a single employer plan or you're part of an MEP now, there is no change to discrimination testing. That's all done from a adopting plan level. When you're in a PEO with an MEP, there's full integration with payroll, meaning that you don't have to worry about the submission process either way. And when you move to a single employer plan, one thing you definitely want to consider as you're considering who your record keeper will be for the 401k, as well as who the payroll provider will be, is there integration between those two parties? There is usually what we call 180 or one-way integration, where the payroll provider will agree to send files directly to the record keeper, but oftentimes they won't accept files back from the record keeper. Two-way integration, otherwise known as 360, is becoming a lot more common. So I would definitely add that to your list of just making your life easier with that payroll submission process, each payroll. There are increased responsibilities with administrative tasks. So you're going to be now at a plan level verifying payroll data. I mentioned signing the 5500. The record keeper will prepare it. You'll sign it and submit it directly to the DOL. Process any corrections. And then plan amendments. You may have self-initiated plan amendments, such as you add auto-enroll or you do a different type of plan design, or there could be regulatory amendments, but you always want to make sure that you get those amendments from the record keeper, they get signed and filed, and they're implemented into the record keeping system. as a single employer plan, you do have to designate either an individual or multiple people that will be the fiduciaries of the 401k plan. The fiduciaries are subject to ERISA, and they must act prudently and solely in the best interest of participants. So just as a summary, a few of the things that fiduciaries are responsible for is ongoing monitoring of the service fee, the record-keeping fees and their service, monitoring accuracy, making sure at the end of the year there's testing done. There are required notifications that employees need to receive, and there's different ways they need to receive them, so that needs to be done. And then there's filing requirements. And then the big one is also investments. So there needs to be a way for you to evaluate your investments from a performance and a cost standpoint and to document it. And oftentimes we recommend having an investment policy statement that outlays what your requirements are for when you're going to remove a fund, keep a fund, and it outlines how you're actually scoring those funds. So good news is there's a lot of ways to mitigate fiduciary liability and make it a lot easier for you. One of them is establishing a 401k committee. So the 401k committee typically has representatives from HR and from finance, sometimes from legal. You'll set up a cadence on how often you meet. Most of my clients meet semi-annual, a lot annual. The purpose of the committee meeting will be to do the investment analysis, make your decisions from a fiduciary standpoint, analyze your current costs and how it compares to the market, make sure you're satisfying compliance requirements. And a big one here, and where the lawsuits have come from, is not necessarily that the plan sponsor of the 401k did anything wrong. It's been lack of documentation. So one of the things that we do is we take responsibility for those documenting the committee meetings, and they're very important to document the reason why you've made a change or why you decided, let's say, to keep a fund that wasn't doing well. The DOL doesn't look at that you kept a fund that wasn't doing well. They just want to know there was a good reason behind. There is a great way to delegate fiduciary responsibility, and that's on the investment side. So you can hire a what we call a co-fiduciary or a full fiduciary. You see those 321 and 338 there. That's a code in the IRS, and it gives you the ability to outsource the investment due diligence and the fiduciary liability. The 321 is a co-fiduciary, so the 401k consultant would be the fiduciary on the advice and recommendations that they give to the committee. The 338 means that the committee says, you, 401k consultant, take all liability on the investment decisions and just notify us when you're going to be making a change. The 401k consultant often leads the committee meetings, as I mentioned, and documents the meeting minutes. There is the ability to delegate some administrative liability, which certainly helps, and it's called 316. This one's a little more tricky because there are a lot of third-party administrators that do 316, but let's say there's 8 items that need to be covered on 316. They may cover 3 or 5 or 7. It's all over with different 316 fiduciaries, and there's actually not many that do all of them. So you just want to be careful and make sure you find out what is exactly being covered by that outside 316 and what you're still responsible for. Go to the next. Okay, so really this is sort of a summary. ERISA requires expertise in the areas of selections and ongoing monitoring of investments, on administration, I mentioned that 316, and then selection and monitoring of the service provider. And this is exactly why a lot of 401k plans have a 401k consultant or advisor involved, is because ERISA does allow you to outsource those areas when you don't have expertise in those areas. Okay, so the advantages of a single employer plan: a lot more flexibility, so you can choose the record keeper that fits your plan size. There's certain record keepers that are better in the small market, others in mid and large. You can pick a record keeper that maybe fits your culture better, with great support from a financial wellness standpoint. You can choose your own investment lineup with little restrictions. You can do what you want as long as it's able to be done on the plan document with plan design, and you can choose your own 401k consultant. Definite cost advantages: if you're starting to grow out of a PEO, the chances are you've grown up in the MEP, and you may be subsidizing some of the smaller companies that are in the MEP. So you could find that because of your plan assets and your average account balance, your cost can be less outside the MEP than you're paying inside the MEP. Typically a higher level of service, when you have a 401k consultant that runs an MEP, they're really staying at the plan level. They don't have the time or resources to get down at a adopting employer or even an employee level. And when you have a separate single employer plan and you have an advisor, they really can dig into those committee meetings. They can do a lot on employee engagement strategies that are really personalized to your organization and to your employees.
The timing of this is that you really ideally will start thinking about it 6 months out. We're obviously into 5 months out at this point. It's still very doable at this point. The reason why we want to encourage people to start out so far is to select your brokers, select your plans. You've got a lot to identify in terms of providers and support in making this transition happen. And once that system is selected, then there's contract signing aspect of that, which takes a little bit of time. But for us to do a project transition, the meat and potatoes of that project transition are approximately 3 months. So you want to have everything lined up before that point so that you have at minimum 3 months to do the system and data transition from your PEO. So keep that in mind. So just to sum up the components of this transition, you've got the payroll, the benefits, the workers' comp, P&C, 401k, and you want to make sure you have the support you need on the payroll and the Ben admin and HR perspective so that those functions are supported internally. And you want a system transition. And then the second phase of that system transition and the policies and practices need to happen so that you've got those workflows working appropriately within your organization. And then communicating, right? Employees and managers need to be communicated to and make sure that they're ready for this transition. So it probably feels totally overwhelming, everything we've gone through today, but I can tell you that we've done it many times, Sequoia's done it many times, and we're here to make it as seamless as possible. If you choose us to help, there are other, obviously, providers out there that you can lean on. Thank you for attending. I wanted to have an opportunity to leave our contact information up in case you're interested in reaching out to any of us. Again, I'm sure Sequoia would agree with this, that if you are interested in just having a conversation with any of us, we'd be happy to support those conversations and as you think through this process. And again, our job is to hopefully make it as seamless as possible. With that, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and best to all of you through this pandemic and beyond.